everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to my vegetable garden. I live in Spokane, Washington, and it is hot, hot, hot. It's supposed to be 100 degrees today, and there is no relief in sight for the next 10 days. Ugh! We garden in hardiness zone 5B. Most of Spokane is in zone 6, but we're in more of a microclimate, so that's why we get a little bit colder than most of the Spokane area does. So today's topic is row covers that you can use to protect your vegetable crops. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each, how you use them, and so on. Now, row covers can be used to protect your crops against the weather, against different types of insects, and against birds. The first type of row cover I want to talk about is floating row cover. I have used it for years and I absolutely love it. So it is made of a woven type of a polyester fabric, and it is great for several things. Now it comes in different weights, and so the mid-weight and heavy weight protect against frost. The heavier it gets, the less light it lets through, but the more frost protection it provides. Now this one is the lightweight version, and it really is just used to keep insects away from your crops. So things like aphids, cabbage worms, and so on. So here's an example of floating row cover in use. It's covering my beet bed, and that's because I'm trying to keep the leaf miners away from them. They will ruin the leaves of beets, spinach, and Swiss chard in nothing flat, and so that's why I'm using floating row cover on this particular bed. Now the routine with all kinds of covers is that you typically put down some type of hoops, whether they're metal or from black poly sprinkler pipe, or from, in our case, leftover 1/2-inch drip tubing that we didn't need anymore. And then you suspend the row cover over it. It is very important that you weigh it down around all the edges so that the wind will not blow it off. So this again is the lightest weight floating row cover, and I'm using it as a physical barrier to keep certain types of insects away from my crops. So in my garden, the types of things that I want to keep away are aphids and cabbage worms. That would also include cabbage loopers and diamondback caterpillars and leaf miners. Those are really the things that I'm worried about in my garden, and so this works great. Let's talk about the pros and cons of floating row cover. The good things are that depending upon the weight, it will give some type of frost protection. It acts as a physical barrier, like I mentioned, to keep those different types of insects away. And if you take good care of it, it will last many years. This has been my go-to row cover for decades. What about the cons? Well, the big one for me is that you can't see what's happening with the plants without lifting it. It can also be a bit too warm underneath for certain types of plants because there's no air circulation. This is the second type of row cover that I wanted to talk about. This is bridal veil netting. It's also known as tulle, and a friend of mine recommended it several years ago, so I've had quite a few years to test it. This is what's known as premium quality, so it has the smaller holes in it. That is very important. And I bought a bolt of it online because that was the best deal. I've used it only for insect protection. The pros are that you can see what's going on with the plants underneath. It sort of gives protection from insects. The cons are that the aphids did get through the holes every now and then, which was frustrating. And tulle is not very durable. It's not UV stabilized, so it does not last very long, and it's very easy to tear. It's just not real durable. Now, bird netting is another type of a row cover you can use. You probably can't see it, but it is here. And this works great if you have bird issues in your garden. Now for us, we deal with California quail in our garden. And we love to watch them. They're gorgeous birds, and they all have babies right now, so they're fun to watch too. But the problem with quail is that they love to nibble on freshly sprouted seeds, and they also love lettuce. Now in this case, I have a freshly planted bed, and I do not want them eating those little seedlings. So I put this protection over for the time being. I'll leave it in place for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then I'll take it off. In the case of lettuce, I have grown it under bird netting for years, and you need to leave it covered the whole time because both quail and finches love to nibble on the leaves. And I like my lettuce and salad, so I want to keep the quail and the finches away from those leaves. The last type of row cover I want to talk about is agricultural insect netting, and it's sometimes called garden insect netting. I've heard about this in the past few years, but it only seemed to be available in the UK and Europe, which was really frustrating. But I suddenly found sources for it this year, so I was really anxious to try it. My source for this netting was agfabric.com. The pros are that you can very easily see through it. It has good air circulation for the plants, so it doesn't get too hot underneath. The mesh is very fine, so insects like aphids can't get through it. I have not had a single aphid get through it on 2 of my beds that I'm testing it on. It's extremely durable and UV stabilized, so I should be able to use it for years. Do I have any cons? Well, maybe that it can be hard to locate, but I am so happy with how it has performed for us this year. Now let's look at it in the garden. Now many of you are probably familiar with this hinged covered raised bed. This is a project that is in my book, The Vegetable Garden Pest Handbook. It takes you through all the steps for making it. And this is what we put the agricultural insect netting on. So this is slick. This whole bed had lettuce growing in it. Now, of course, it's too hot. I just have a little bit of arugula and a few straggler lettuce plants, but that's it. I also have cabbage seedlings in here, and I am protecting them from cabbage worms and aphids. Here's another view of the bed. Look how easy it is to see inside so you know how your plants are doing. Here's the other hinged covered raised bed. And I am growing Swiss chard, beets, and a few extra leeks that I had this spring. And this is to protect the beets and the Swiss chard from leaf miners. This is the third and final raised bed in our garden that has agricultural insect netting over it. This is the broccoli bed. Broccoli is a member of the cabbage family, and because of that, they are very susceptible to aphids and different types of cabbage worms. In this case, it's not a hinged covered raised bed, but it's rather just draped over hoops, and then I very carefully weighed it down around the edges so it couldn't blow off, and so that certain types of insects couldn't sneak in that way. We have not had any insect problems whatsoever with these plants. Now they're looking a little bit peaked. That's partly because of the heat, and also we've already harvested from them twice, and so we cut them back a bit in the hopes of getting more secondary heads. But I am just so happy with this agricultural insect netting. Now I wanted to bring up a very important point, and that is that row covers are not 100% protection against insects. Here's why. Slugs can still be a problem because they lay eggs in the soil, so they might already be in your bed. And they're good at hiding in nooks and crannies in your bed. So if you see some slug damage on something that's been covered with either floating row cover or agricultural insect netting, don't blame the cover. It's just that they're already in there, and so you have to deal with them, unfortunately. Pill bugs and sow bugs can be in and around the soil, and so can earwigs. There are also some types of insects that overwinter in the soil. So if you had an insect problem in the bed you want to cover this year, the problem was last year, that cover might trap those insects within the bed. And this brings home the idea that it is so important to rotate your crops so you're not growing the same crop in the same bed year after year. And I have a lot of information about crop rotation on my website, susansinthegarden.com. Now there's another important thing I want to mention if you're using floating row cover, bridal veil or tulle, or agricultural insect netting. And that has to do with pollination. I can leave floating row cover or the agricultural insect netting over my cabbage family crops because they do not need pollination at all, so I can leave it on the whole time. The same applies to beet family crops, beets, spinach, and Swiss chard. They don't need to be pollinated. Now, sometimes you might have problems with insects on plants that do need to be pollinated, but they really are bothered by insects early on. What you can do is you can plant your seeds or seedlings and immediately cover them with floating row cover or bridal veil netting or agricultural insect netting, and leave it on until the plants begin to bloom. Then you would take it off so the pollinators can get to those blooms and work their magic. But the best thing is that you got the plants off to a really healthy, strong start, and so they're more able to resist insect attacks from that point on. So keep in mind what you're covering. You know, I don't need to cover this whole garden because for the most part, we don't have that many insect problems. But the aphids, the cabbage worms, and the leaf miners are the ones that give me a lot of trouble. And the great thing is their host plants, these different types of vegetables, are not needing any kind of pollination. So that works. Okay, that's all for now. I'm going to head indoors where it's a lot cooler. I hope you found this video interesting and helpful. And if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. I'll see you next week.